So let's say someone goes to Unbound, and Unbound is, pretty darn flat, but there's some hills and there's some mud, right? And they go to Unbound, and their experience is that whenever the Peloton really surges or they're going over little rollers, they're losing ground in the group, or maybe eventually when the race shatters, they get dumped on a roller, right? And that's where, they're kind of in an established group after the race is, the pattern has sort of borne out, and they get dumped and they feel like, well, I didn't have the punch to make it over that roller. Like if I just had the punch to make it over that roller, I would have been fine in that group, because then, it was flat from there to the line, and I caught, then I would have finished with that group. But instead I lost 8 minutes and ended up in the next group or something.
Everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Colby Pearce, welcome back. You guys all know him from his racing Palmares, and if you don't know him from that, you probably know him from EF coaching or the last podcast. Colby, thanks for coming back. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
We have a bunch of different topics, especially as we're recording this middle of March, but coming into spring, there's always a ton of questions that people have about coming out of base. What do I train? Do I train anaerobic? Do I not? When do I hit the group ride? You guys might have seen Colby on GCN talking about FTP, and I really like that, so we'll probably hit on that. And then if we have time, there's a couple other miscellaneous little topics that we can get into, but I think this is a big general open-ended question, but I'd love to hear what you think even when we talk about this, Colby. Coming out of base, how does an athlete determine what to work on? This could be a 2-hour podcast in itself, but maybe what are some threads that they could try to follow to hone in their training?
Yeah. Okay, so we have to ask, what are the demands of the event, right? What are we training for? And we can use a generic example if you want. We could say someone's training for gravel, because that's pretty common. Maybe they're training for Unbound or Steamboat or Big Sugar, whatever. And we also have to ask what climate they're in, because base means different things to different people, right? So if you're in Texas or Florida or San Diego or something, then base is probably what we mean by base is old school base. Like you've actually been able to ride a lot of kilometers, a lot of volume on the bike. But if you're in Colorado, especially this year, like we've just been getting destroyed. By destroyed, I mean we've had a real winter. Mm-hmm. So there's not been a lot of opportunity to cycle outside. January we had some, I don't know, like it's all a blur now, but it seems like it was 7 degrees every day in January as a high. So, and myself, I don't ride indoors anymore. I cashed all those chips in like 10 years ago. So I'll just go running or skiing or whatever, but people are on Zwift. So, okay, you're on or some sort of indoor platform, whatever that may be. And that's great. But what does that mean? Now you're riding for an hour and a half, maybe 2. And so then you get bored. So then you add intensity. So your air quotes base, which we conceive of as, long, steady distance or volume-based riding at lower intensity, sort of gets smashed into a reverse periodization model, which is in the winter, I'm not riding as much because there's not as much daylight and it's cold. So now I'm going to add intensity, and all of a sudden everything blends together. So I think it's important to, we always have to ask the question, relative to what? If you've had a proper base and you've been riding outdoors quite a bit, you're in a little warmer climate and you're afforded that luxury, or maybe you're one of those people who's got the time and attention to ride Zwift for many, many hours, ride indoors many, many hours. And so you've actually ridden, and you also didn't get sucked into the intensity vortex. Then maybe you've got some base miles under your legs. And I would say one of our litmuses can be power to heart rate ratio. I think that can be useful. I think it can also be a misleading metric. So how I would use it is you could use it indoors on a trainer. And this is one of the only times where I would recommend you could use something like erg mode. Probably the only one. And you would just do an aerobic endurance ride, or a ride targeted around an intensity where you think is maybe your fat max. Maybe you took an inside test and you've got a more accurate line on that. Maybe you just sort of intuited it. Maybe you're just using your aerobic endurance heart rate, plus or minus, that's going to be this much. and you look at you do it for a set duration. So everything's pretty controlled, right? I mean, you're in your trainer cave. You've probably got the same fan and the same ambient air temperature, more or less, and the same humidity, and you're on the same bike, and you've got the same power meter, and you calibrate it because you're paying attention. And so then you do an hour and a half at whatever, we'll call it zone 2. And your average heart rate is this, and your power to heart rate decoupling is 3%, or it's 7%, or it's 10%. And when we get to when that sort of plateaus, when you get a response from that, you do that every week and you get a plateau in that response, that suggests to me that you've got a good baseline of aerobic fitness.
When you say plateau, just sorry to cut you off, meaning like there's no change or what?
No, I think some change is normal. You might expect 3-5%. If again, it depends a little bit on the intensity you're doing and your ambient air temperature. And the one variable there is cadence. Right? You can't do one of those at 104 RPM average and then another one at 80 and compare the numbers. You're trying to keep everything, you're trying to put all your ducks in a row. And if you do that and you see a positive trend in that power to heart rate relationship, and then it plateaus, I think it'd be reasonable to assume that indicates a good baseline of aerobic fitness. So
what about when you said the intensity vortex, what are some considerations for people that said, you know what, I was in Chicago and I did kind of get sucked into this. I Zwifted ZRL every Tuesday. Yeah. I got bored by Friday. I hit it again on Saturday. Oops. Yeah. I was kind of going hard twice a week, full blast. Should they reset with base as much as possible before, like as spring races are happening, or is it kind of too late? Or because now you've got races happening on the weekend and they're like, as you said, it's kind of all bleeding together. How do they parse it out?
Yeah, I think there's a natural rhythm there. If you live somewhere like Chicago or Colorado or whatever, you can't. I don't think it makes sense to just go from intensity into more intensity and never really check the volume box. I think what is the first requirement of our sport from a physiological perspective? It's endurance. Mm-hmm. It's an endurance sport first. You got to make it to the line first. Then you can worry about whether you make it over the climb with the lead group or whether you're going to beat somebody in a sprint. So, when we do what we do as humans, we take something that's really complicated and messy and we try to understand it. We break it down into basic blocks. For me, the first essential building block of being an endurance sport is riding your bike for long periods of time. So I think it's important to keep that in your program at some point in the year. And if you can't do it in December or January in Chicago, then you should do it at other points in the season. And I think in the end, it can all work out. I've had seasons myself where I've sort of ignored volume and been all in on intensity. And then I've had other years where I'm like, nope, I'm not touching any intensity. I'm going to do volume. And can I say that my characteristics as a rider, excuse me, were a little different those summers? Yes. But also we have to be really important not to play Marvel Universe here, right? Meaning, there's not 4 universes where we had a Colby who did different training, but everything else was identical. It never works that way. And so it's the wrong question to say, well, is it better for me or is it perfect for me to just do 5-minute intervals all winter? Or is it more perfect for me to stick hardcore to the low volume or to the high volume, low intensity? Because we don't have an N of 1. We don't have that Marvel Universe where I can isolate that theoretical Colby and or theoretical Jane or whoever and make them do one type of training and then compare the outcome. It's too simplistic of a mindset, but that's the way our brains think. But for me, it's the wrong question.
I like that. What's some people are going to hear the erg mode comment. What's your maybe not beef with erg mode, but you don't like it. What's the reasoning behind that?
It puts the cart before the horse. It causes all the problems of power meter meltdown that we have. So, okay, there are multiple layers to that. I'll try to unpack them quickly. But the first is that for most people, most of the time, and bike riders are so weird. I don't know why we live in our own little solipsistic universes. It's such an individualist sport. But people come to me, they're like, I don't know what the deal is with me. It's me, but it's so much harder to do intervals on the trainer. And I'm like, yeah, welcome to the universe of everybody. Like RPE goes up on the trainer. Let's just say that. That's a thing. It's extremely common for that to be people's experiences. So, okay, you do whatever, pick some random numbers, for example, let's say 350 watts for a 3 minute interval outdoors. And you did that all last summer and you smashed it. So now it's winter. And let's just put on the shelf for the moment that you had like 3 weeks of off season and then some hiking and you haven't done intervals because you were seasonal, like most athletes should be. And so now you're less fit, you're less sharp than you were during the race season. So it is unrealistic for you to expect to do the same numbers for 3 minutes that you could in July when you were racing a lot and doing group rides and all the things. But let's just park that for a minute. So you get on your trainer, you're like, all right, I'm doing my first effort. My coach gave me these 3 minute intervals. I'm going to go do them. And I remember my best ones last summer were 350. So I'm going to set my erg mode at 350. You're just setting yourself up for failure because, first of all, we all have selective memory about what we all round up on our little historical wattages, right? I mean, I'm 52 now, so let me sit you down, son, and tell you about how good I was back in 1998. It's like the older I was, the faster I get. Well, we all do the same thing from last summer even. And so we glorify and optimize our best 3 minute interval is like, and you look back at the day, like, I actually only did 350 for one 3 minute interval the entire summer. But for some reason, I'm basing all my efforts on that. And then we go on the trainer, we put it on erg mode, and you can see what's going to happen. You're going to get about 90 seconds into that, and it's going to be about, I don't know, 5%, 10% too intense. And then we account for the fact that RPE just goes up on the trainer. So in my opinion, often people use erg mode and they just implode. That's the issue. They implode. And it's not that the issue isn't that they imploded because they set the intensity too high. It's that they gave themselves, they shot themselves in the foot because they gave up a chance for what could have been a productive workout. I mean, if you're doing 5x3 on 3 off or 6 or 7x3 on 3 off, and that's your workout for the day, that's a bricklaying day. That's a day where you just have to go, this is hard labor. And, my boss might think that I need to put 100 bricks on this wall today, but maybe I only get to 82. It was still a day where I added bricks to the wall. That's what it is. It's a day of just hard work. Like those are just days where you just have to knuckle down and just dig in, and whatever the numbers are, you go for it. Now, there's a caveat to that, and that's the day where you are completely empty and you really should just stop riding your bike and go take a nap. I mean, if you're empty and your legs are totally useless wet rags, don't force it. And you shouldn't, if your normal range for a 3 minute interval is, 320 is out of shape and 350 is smashing, all the watts, and you're doing 264, then it's like, all right, go take a nap, go take a couple days easy. You overcooked yourself. So that caveat aside, it's just a day of laying bricks. We just got to do hard work. It's going to be a hard day.
Do you think people should ramp into that at all? Like 310, 320, 330, and maybe 350, or just go for it and see where you're at, maybe based off the first one with like, don't explode?
Depends on what your intent is. And maybe a little bit where your fitness is. Intent meaning if your intent is to use a 5x3 minutes on, 3 minutes off to achieve a high number of minutes at or near VO2 max, which would be the physiological response we would probably guess you would want to instill in that type of workout, then you could make an argument that you kind of wanted to like hit it running and get that VO2 max state, drive that state, and hold on to it as long as possible. That's sort of the point of the workout. So if that's your goal, then not really. You should probably just be like, yeah, I'm going to start out at 330 or 320 and just kind of hang on for dear life. And also acknowledge that actually the last effort might be, closer to threshold than some sort of VO2 max power. But as long as your sense of perceived exertion is super high and your heart rate's high and your respiratory rate is really high, then you're doing your job. You're still putting bricks on the wall, right? That's the other problem with erg mode is it doesn't allow that sort of subtlety to, like my effort is my output, which is what power is. My output is declining as I go through an interval set, but I feel that I'm still getting the physiological stressor that I want, the strain. That's the goal of the workout. It's not actually output. Like output is a proxy for what we're trying to accomplish. What we're trying to accomplish is to make all your little mitochondria freak out. and go, whoa, this is really hard. So that when they rest, they're like, I need to adapt to this stress. That's what training is. It's not numbers. Remember, math is an artificial language we invented. It's a construct of the human psyche. So
That'll be on the next podcast.
cool.
Okay, so for a quick recap, then, for someone listening who might have gotten sidetracked and there's a lot of details in there, look at the demand of your event. Ask yourself, what type of base did you truly do? See what's the difference there. If you've been hitting it, don't keep hitting it. You have to have the volume and the endurance rides and try and even that out. And then, probably map back how much time do you have to your event and start putting in the puzzle pieces there. Does that sound like an accurate summation?
Yeah, I think so. I would add to that, if the demands of your event are that you're going to be on the bike for this gets a little tricky. If you're going to be on the bike for 5 or 6 hours, then it stands to reason you should be able to be on the bike that long in training.
Mm-hmm.
However, we're now in a day and age where events are way longer than people's longest duration commonly. And that didn't used to be the case. It used to be that if you did if a 6-hour road race was your longest event, you made sure you could ride for 6 hours or maybe more in training. Not necessarily hard, not necessarily with all those efforts, but you made it sure you could do that volume. But now people sign up for Unbound 200 and maybe it takes them 12 hours or 16 hours or longer to do that event. And no one is going out and doing a 16-hour training ride to prepare for Unbound if they're taking that long to do it normally.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a different paradigm where you accept that on your race day, you're kind of moonshotting it, right? And you're going to go way overboard and you just kind of are hanging on for dear life and doing what you can to survive. And that's a different model. But, and some of that comes down to, are you really at an event to participate and complete the event, or are you there to be competitive as a racer? And those are kind of two different worlds. So if you're there to race the event, I would argue that you should for sure be able to complete the duration of your event, your target event, your A race in training at least. Yeah. Even if you're not matching the KJs and the time in zones and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think the time in zones could be a really tricky one just because you're going to be having that race day riding out of your skin. But that time is just if it's a 9-hour event and you only ride 5.5 hours, there's just things you don't know what you don't know when hour 8 comes and you still have an hour and a half to go. It's a really good point. So I think then athletes seem to always ask, and there had been a lot of chatter, it seems like the past couple years ago, of more of the understanding, maybe this is kind of from the inside guys, if you're developing your anaerobic or glycolytic metabolism, you could technically be hurting your threshold power. So some people shy away from it. They don't know how much they should do. Yep. I think that we've heard for years, someone say, oh, well, just go do a couple brush up workouts and you'll be ready to go. And I personally don't believe that's true, especially for an athlete that's not naturally anaerobic. They can't just go brush up on something that they don't have. So I think those athletes kind of can get themselves into a pickle when it comes race day and it's just way too hard for them. So with all of that said, is there a type of rider or type of race, as we're saying, event demand, where people should really focus on anaerobic training, or maybe should everybody dabble in it before races, or maybe some people shouldn't? And I realize, again, huge can of worms, but let's see what Colby has to say.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really relevant question. That's a good question. Again, I think it comes down to the two parameters I look at are the demands of the event and the characteristics of the rider, right? So let's make a hypothetical example to help explain the concept. So let's say someone goes to a race and they have a particular experience. We'll pick are you cool with me using gravel races as an example? Is that fine?
I think it's good because it's similar to road and
Yeah. Okay. So let's say someone goes to Unbound, and Unbound is, pretty darn flat, but there's some hills and there's some mud, right? And they go to Unbound and their experience is that whenever the peloton really surges or they're going over little rollers, they're losing ground in the group, or maybe eventually when the race shatters, they get dumped on a roller, right? And that's where, they're kind of in an established group after the race is, the pattern has sort of borne out, and they get dumped. and they feel like, well, I didn't have the punch to make it over that roller. Like if I just had the punch to make it over that roller, I would have been fine in that group, because then, it was flat from there to the line, and I caught, then I would have finished with that group. But instead I lost 8 minutes and ended up in the next group or something. So in that case, you would say, well, what's the rate limiting factor of that rider's performance? It was probably that glycolytic power over that little rolling hill, right? They didn't have a snap to follow the group. And sometimes I have riders who are like this. They're very steady state oriented. We'll call them like a diesel characteristic, right? And they've got a very well developed aerobic engine. This can also happen over, like in an example, like an oat route or a road race with big climbs. You go over big climbs and then you're down the descent, and then in the valley there's like rollers, and the groups are they're gluing together, they're recoalescing, or they're coalescing, and sometimes those riders who are very aerobic don't have the snap to make it over those little rolling hills when the pace is really heated in between the big climbs. Jumping out of corners would be another example where riders who are glycolytically not trained or limited would have a challenge staying with the group. And so if you got dumped, if that's your rate limiting performance, or your rate limiting factor to your performance in your A race, then that tells me you need more glycolytic firepower in your arsenal. You need another arrow in your quiver, right? And I agree with you. You're not going to just brush that up by suddenly doing some 45-second long efforts or 90-second efforts, the week or 2 weeks before the race. Like, that system is probably relatively dormant and not super active. So you got to start to chip away at it and wake up those muscle cells. And really, we're talking about the ability to go between fast twitch and slow twitch fibers, right? And use a little more sugar in your system and a little less fat max, a little less aerobic metabolism. So you're changing metabolic pathways to make energy, and you've got to activate those in training somewhat regularly. Conversely, you can have the other problem where people are maybe a little more glycolytic than the demands of their event. So they're, in the first 30K of the race, they're all over the front and they're following every little surge, and they're, leading the group up rollers and stuff. And the crosswinds come and they're in the first group, but then an hour and a half in, all of a sudden, they just seem to sort of bog down and slow down and explode, and they can't eat enough. That's another sign. They're just slamming gels left, right, and center, and they just can't eat enough, and they somehow manage to bonk anyway, right? That's a sign that their metabolism is heavily dominated by sugar burning and glycolytic energy selection, right? That's their substrate of choice. But in a longer race, we have to dip from both tanks, the nitrous tank and the diesel tank, and we got to have a blend of both. So if that's the case, then you've got to train their characteristics a bit and get them to chill out a little on the short, snappy stuff, if their goal is to do better in a longer race, and get them to get that aerobic engine, that fat max characteristic going.
One thing that I think you make a really good point, that when we're talking about someone's A race, the most important thing you're training for, how important it is to have these practice races before, so you can get these insights that Colby's talking about. If you're doing one race before your quote unquote A race, you're not really giving yourself a lot of research time. Now, maybe you have some group rides or other things, but I would encourage athletes to think about that. So this is like important on the gravel research that you want to do, so hey, how am I responding to these moves? I think I think that can just get lost for some newer racers. What's actually bringing up group rides? Would you think what is the benefit if you find some to really hard group rides? And maybe a little caveat there is to the people who are already the Cat 1-2s. Are the group rides not hard enough? Are they just going for the ego stomping? How do you flesh that out with like some amateur riders that you have? When should they go? When shouldn't they? Or maybe a better way to put it is, how can an amateur rider find value in a group ride?
Yeah. I mean, so when we go on a group ride, we're giving up the ability to precisely control and modulate our training, right? And I'm sure we've been on group rides where guys are like, they show up to the group ride. I'll pick on guys for a moment. I don't think women do this. They're smarter than this. The guys show up and they're like, well, I got to do intervals today. It's like, dude, this isn't the place to go do intervals. You want to do intervals and precisely control your load. Intervals are all about precisely controlling the output and the time and the recovery and the terrain, right? And you can't do any of that on a group ride effectively. So don't fool yourself. So that's the first thing to be said. But generally, that paradigm applies also in the sense that when you go on a group ride, you're basically surrendering control to what the group is doing. So, you can go on some group rides and they can be insanely hard, maybe harder than your interval days. Just depends on where you live and who's on the ride and what your relative level is compared to their strength. I mean, we have legendary group rides around the US. There's the shootout in Tucson, which I've never been on, but I hear repeated horror stories about. And there's a ride here in Boulder called the Stages Ride, which is insanely hard. It's shorter. It's a weekday ride. It's like a lunch ride, but really fit people show up and the local pros show up. So sometimes it depends a lot on the ride, but I think, we have to look at the characteristics of the overall load that we want the athlete to have going into their races. And we also want to consider the characteristics of the group ride. Like some riders really struggle with carrying speed in a group, right? In a peloton, that sense of being dragged along by the peloton and then having to be responsive and reactive to those micro accelerations you get in a group, right? Especially when the pace is really heated and maybe you're in a pace line and you're rolling through. That is very difficult to simulate on your own. And you can see that clearly in the power graphs. The only other really good way to simulate that is through motor pacing. And a lot of riders don't have access or safe enough terrain and roads to go motor pacing, right? So your choice to brush up and get that speed, those micro accelerations, that might be a really good choice to go on a group ride. So including those periodically in your program, especially if your event race is going to involve some peloton time, that's a reasonable choice. But I think you want to look, the best way to do it for me as a coach is I look at the characteristics of the group ride and kind of say, okay, how much time in particular zones is my rider getting? Are they floating along at a really high heart rate and a high cadence, but the power's kind of low? Well, that's not a good or bad thing. It's just a characteristic of the ride. So let's make sure that if they really want to do this ride and include it in their program, because a social component, being social is an important part of being a cyclist. It doesn't mean it should dominate everything, but it can be an important part of it. So they want to do this ride. And so we look and say, what are the physiological characteristics that we're getting out of this training session, this group ride? And then how do we make sure we complement that in their other work that they're doing on their own? And then you have a balanced program, right? I think that's a reasonable way to approach it. Also, I'll say that, group rides tend to happen on a weekly basis because we're dictated by the 7-day rhythm. Most people's lives are, and most racers are, because races tend to happen on the weekends, the big ones. But that doesn't mean that because a group ride happens every Tuesday, you have to do it every Tuesday. There's a universe where you can do it every other Tuesday or 3 of the 4 Tuesdays a month or whatever, and then you skip it. And I think that can be a really key reminder for us. Just because the group ride or the local training race, right? There's a series, I think it's in Austin, called I can't remember the name of it. There's some criterion. Which one is it? The Driveway. Thank you. That's it. I mean, this thing happens, like, it's already started probably a month ago and it goes until November, right? And man, I mean, what a great resource for people to have this local crit to go do. We actually don't have a local training criterium in Boulder right now. We haven't for years. And that's its own thing. But just because it happens, for 11 months a year, it does not mean you should go do it every Thursday or whatever day it is. It's too repetitive, too much of the same stress. I mean, this is a basic natural law of training that's really important. Is you do too much of the same thing week after week, after month, and guess what happens? Your body becomes non-responsive. This is true of anything, right? Beer, coffee, pasta. Like, you can't watch the same movie over and over again. I mean, you can, but after a while it loses its effect, right? It's like I listened to too much U2 in college. Can't listen to it anymore. I just fried myself on U2. Loved him at the time, hit my U2 threshold. So you don't want to hit your U2 group ride threshold, I guess is what I'm saying.
I love that. Sometimes it's what not to do as opposed to figuring out what to do.
Mm-hmm.
So you had people should look up the GCM video that you did on FTP and really kind of talking about some similar threads that we had touched on, I think in the first podcast, how, it really shouldn't be the holy grail. I was curious, what do you feel like gets ignored from athletes when they look at their metrics? And what about aerodynamics these days? It's obviously so prevalent in the equipment that we buy, but should athletes be trying to like watts per CDA as opposed to watts per kg?
I mean, I would love that. That's a great question. I think watts per kg just gets so played out, and people focus on it so much, and some of that is because we glorify certain riders in the sport. You know, Poggi being the obvious example right now, and what he does, he just goes to the climb and rides away from everyone. So the natural conclusion is, well, if I just have more watts per kilo, I'll do what Poggi does and win a bunch of races solo, and that is like first grade. That's a kindergarten level thinking to solve what is like a multi PhD level problem of how to win a bike race. So um, it's not wrong, you know, if you have a nuclear bomb of watts per kg and you've got 100 other things that could defeat you, a hundred other rate limiting factors that you're proficient at, then that's a great strategy. But banking on you training to have that outcome like Poggi is, I think, a poor bet because he's obviously point one of point one in really, in my opinion, two things. One is his global myofascial tension is super high. Which what I mean when I say that is he basically is like a marathoner on a bike. If you watch him, like he's got this little rhythm, this little springy rhythm, and he's very spring-like. So he just winds that spring up and just lets it go, and it just ticks along at a very high rate. And the only way that works is if you have a lot of global tension, myofascial tension, where there's not a lot of wasted energy. There's movement, but it's very rhythmic and it pendulates. And then the other real part, I'm way off in the weeds now. The other part I think is interesting about Poggi is I think he's point one of point one with lactate processing. And if you heard, I think Inigo did a podcast on, I think it was Peter Attia, where he was talking about how Poggi has this enzyme that transports lactate across the cell membrane, and he's like way above everybody else in that respect. So that means that he can use an enormous amount of lactate aerobically for his fuel line. So he's got like an extra fuel line, basically, is how you think about it, of lactate, right? Lactate is fuel for the aerobic engine. So, sorry, where was I? Will you repeat your question, please?
No, so then to that, what do you think when a rider who might be self-coached is looking at their metrics, they know their threshold,
Thank
they
you.
might not even know their VO2 max, but what metrics should they be looking at besides just FTP?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to understand the relationship between your aerobic engine and your glycolytic engine. And there's different tools we could use to look at that. You can go get a Metcart test, and that'll give you some information about that. You could use Inside as a software. A lot of modern softwares will extract it and give it to you. WKO has their metrics, and people quibble about which one is right and which one is wrong. And if you want to go get lost in an internet wormhole on that, have fun. But what we're talking about on the one hand is there's like a teeter-totter relationship, right? So in your left hand, you would say we have your aerobic engine, which at the top end is your VO2 max. It's the maximum amount of oxygen you can process. And on the other hand, your right hand, you have your glycolytic engine. That's the number. We could quantify that in different ways, but one of the ways that's common is you ask how many kgs of work can you do glycolytically using that energy system: fast twitch muscle, sugar burning. The other side is slow twitch fiber, right, and more oxygen burning. Although they can, the aerobic engine can also consume sugar. That's how we get people who are too sugar dependent. So, and so you want to kind of understand the relationship because those exist on a teeter totter. And just as we were talking about earlier, you have someone whose aerobic engine is super, super well trained, and they've got almost nothing in the right hand, no glycolytic energy ability really to express that at all. Then they're going to be extremely one dimensional as a racer, right? They're going to have one weapon, and that's a big diesel engine. But and that might work really well for a handful of bike races, and it might work great for your A race. And if that's the case, then go for it. But in my experience, it's very rare that someone is, when they're extremely aerobic engine dominant and their glycolytic energy supply is through the floor, usually they're rate limited at some point in a race. They have a challenge. They can't get on, coming down the descent or through the valley, or they get ripped off the wheel on a roller, or they make it, the thing about a diesel rider is they've only got really, truly, if they're really extreme, which isn't that uncommon, the only way they can ever win a bike race is solo, ever, because everyone else will wax them in a sprint. And that's not, in spite of what we see with Poggi, not many bike racers are one solo. Like, he's the exception of the exceptions, right? So, especially at the amateur level, like, it's not that common for bike racers to be one solo. It's far more common for groups to come together, and come together as a herd. So you want to have that little bit of snap and pop. And so it's important for riders to have some clue where they are on that spectrum. And the teeter-totter effect is that as you really train one, the other tends to go down. That's important also. That's not law. Occasionally you can kind of do both at once. And occasionally you get riders who somehow are really good at both. Remco's a good example of that. Valverde is a good example of that. Like, characteristics of riders who somehow can have a big aerobic engine and are still somewhat explosive. Poggi's arguably not, in my opinion, even though people might say he's very explosive. I don't think he is. I think his lactate capacity is so high that it sort of lets him exhibit an act of explosiveness, but it's only relative to other aerobic engines. But anyway, just to tease that out a bit. But
so would you say then, for a newer rider who might be thinking, okay, I'm trying to figure out which road I go down, they might be the type of rider that could see gains in both just because they're new? Like, and I would ask this question just so if someone's thinking, man, I'm making these threshold improvements, I don't want that to go down by getting ready for races and getting this anaerobic capacity higher, but they might be somebody who needs to experiment a little bit. And it's like, the rider that is like, oh, I'm, and not to knock Sweet Spot, I get in trouble when I say stuff like that, but like, hey, I'm doing the Sweet Spot thing. And then they finally try VO2 max training and they see that their threshold actually goes up even higher. And they're like, oh, wait a minute, what's going on? So would that be the right type of rider? Like, really experiment and again, you got to do some of your own data testing here. Was that an accurate statement?
Yeah, I think so. And one of the really simple tools we can use to help people, if you don't want to go do inside testing and you don't have WKO, just look at your power profiling on Training Peaks, right? And caveat is that's based on watts per kilo, which is a model of racing in a vacuum. So it's not really an amazing indicator of what you're actually capable of. Just ignore the left-hand side where it says like pro and 1, because pretty much everybody I know is like a 4. And I know guys who have won 1-2 field sprints. Like I know a guy who won a race at Gateway and it said his sprint was like high cat 3, so we have to ignore that because there's a lot more that goes into winning races than just your watts per kilo, which goes back to the second part of your question. Yeah. But looking at that power profile, what we want to know is the shape of it, right? Is it an N shape where it goes down on either end and your best one is 5-minute power? That suggests that currently, assuming you're doing maximal efforts in all those bins, which is an assumption, currently you're expressing your best strength is VO2 max. But is it a long slide, like an angle where everything's on the right side? Then you've got a big aerobic diesel engine and probably not a lot of glycolytic. Conversely, if it's high on the left and slides down, meaning your 5-second and your 1 minute are very high and then everything else kind of goes downhill, then you're very glycolytically trained. And if there's a really big imbalance in one of those, the first thing is go play power meter whack-a-mole. That's what I call it, right? So if your 1 minute sucks and relative to the other ones, and you're like, and then think about it, you're like, well, I've never really done a 1 minute effort as fast as I can. Then a great place to explore your own physiological abilities. That means that's relatively untrained. Go out and just uncork some 1 minute intervals and try different ones. Try them on flat roads, try them on steep climbs, try them on medium climbs. A great way to get a good 1 minute is do about 30 seconds on a flat road and then find a really steep ramp for the second half and just nuke it. Do whatever you can to get up the hill. And see what happens and see how that power profile changes. And then we're getting a more accurate picture of how you physiologically present. And then you have more information. I mean, the first rule of athletics is know thyself, right? Know your own characteristics. So dig into those 5-second efforts, dig into those 1 minute efforts. And these are just bins that Training Peaks makes. They're just archetypes of those energy systems. They're not the end all be all, but they're good information to start with.
Such an important thread there. And especially for people, you mentioned, hey, if people are getting into WKO, realize also just what Colby said, you have to have the maximal efforts. Buddy of mine was like, dude, my threshold just went up like 20 watts. I'm like, what number just fell off your 90-day curve? Have you done a 30-second or a minute lately? He's like, no. I was like, dude, it didn't go up. It doesn't know that you're still an anaerobic beast. Like, go out and crush that, and sadly, you'll see that number go down again. So this is all really good information for people coming out of the season. They know if they're going to figure out how to go to these group rides, what training they should do. Taking a step back and looking really big picture, how do you think amateurs should look at, say, 3 to 5 year development timelines? And actually, is that applicable to amateurs, or is that maybe more the person who's trained for a while, maybe the Cat 1-2s only, or how would this kind of, how do you look at like the down the road?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can say from my own experience and also working with many riders that sometimes we have our goal is shaped by our characteristics, meaning some people as amateurs, they go into cycling and they just love cycling, but they don't really know what they're that good at, you know? And so they do some races and they have some success. And then they conclude, well, I'm really good at long climbs because my early success in racing was in long climbs. But like we were just talking about, sometimes people haven't really touched the glycolytic side of their energy system. They haven't really trained that way. And it could be that they have immense potential as an athlete to express this glycolytic power and do different types of events that were really challenging for them early. So the first thing I would say is when you're getting into the sport, just go play and try different types of races. Try technical courses and non-technical courses and courses with climbing and courses at elevation and sea level and all the things if you can, and enjoy them all and learn. And don't pigeonhole yourself into a characteristic of, well, I'm this type of rider, because those characteristics in many cases, they can be heavily influenced. They can be changed. So if you really get your heart set on a particular race, that's your dream goal or objective, then you want to start to reverse engineer the demands of that race and then train so you're well prepared for it. But it's not only the physiological characteristics, it's all the other things: fueling, hydration, handling, right? Look at Big Sugar, for example. Like, there's quite a bit of technical handling in that course. And Steamboat's changed for this year. We don't know what that looks like. There could be quite a bit of handling in that. I don't know. Historically, there hasn't been in Steamboat until last year. Last year was quite different. So the point being is you want to set your sights on your event and make sure that you're prepared for it adequately as best you can. But in terms of 3-5 year development, I guess the other comment I would say is, that's a really good question. I don't know that I have a North Star for someone there. I mean,
I actually think you might have, I think a good North Star there was be open to exploring different sides of yourself as an athlete that you might not even expect, because as you get better at some things, like something else kind of catches up. And then, I don't know, I think, yeah, this could be a podcast in itself. Like, you join different teams and they do different types of races, and you were gravel before, and now you're like with the crit squad and you're like, oh my God, I'm actually really good at this. And so I think you kind of dropped a North Star in there of just be open to this timeline. I don't know. That's what I liked. I got that from that.
yeah. I mean, well, what I guess the different directions I go with that are, I think I'm maybe a bit of an alien on planet Earth. And even in the sport of cycling, which is a sport of aliens, meaning like we're already the weird ones because presumably we didn't make the football squad and we didn't make the basketball squad, right? I mean, that was my case. I didn't really try. I just knew that wasn't a thing. I was 105 pounds my freshman year of high school. So basically, I was trying not to get beat up most of the time. Conflict avoidance. So there's that. But we're already the weird ones. But when I say I'm an alien, what I mean is cyclists are very tribal, fiercely tribal people. And this is a pretty normal human characteristic. And this is what I mean when I say I'm an alien, because people have asked me in the past, which bike, if you had to pick one, which one would you pick? And I basically can't answer that question. I've had amazing road rides. If I had a road bike, provided I lived in the right part of the world, I could be quite happy only riding a road bike for the rest of my life. Now, that's a big caveat because there are fewer and fewer places where you can get away with that. The same could be said for mountain or gravel and even track, honestly. If I lived next to the right velodrome, I could just only ride track for the rest of my life and I'd be happy. Would I miss the other aspects of cycling? Yes. I don't think that many riders are that flexible in their relationship with the bike. They have their thing and they want to do their thing, and they love road or they love gravel or maybe they love time trials, right? And so when I say to someone, be open to the possibility of, going from criteriums to gravel, is like you said, I think for some riders that's possible, but for a good portion of cyclists, that's like, I'm not doing that. I'm a crit person, and that's 100% fine. If you're enjoying riding your bike and you're doing it safely, then you're doing it right.
Fair.
Yeah.
So one last question that can kind of get in the weeds. I can't remember if we talked about this in the first one, but I think the article came up, torque versus cadence, and you had talked in this article about how terrain can shape our pedaling technique. And you mentioned flat terrain can sort of camouflage a poor technique. What types of flaws in pedaling go unnoticed? And so that somebody, you mentioned like the Florida, the Texas, these flat area places.
Yeah.
What do people need to watch out for that?
So, okay, where are the dead spots of the pedal stroke?
Okay.
Over the top, right? Right when the crank is vertical. So from if we're looking at the right side crank, that'll be our reference. Then we would have the pedals horizontals at 3 o'clock. So when the crank is vertical, it's at 12. So the dead spot at the top is from about 11 to 1. And the dead spot at the bottom is typically it's right around 6, right? And so when we have, it's not to say that we should pedal perfectly round. That is a myth. But we should not have excessive dead spots in our pedal strokes. And the reason those are camouflaged on flat roads, or when you ride a trainer with a heavy flywheel, because once you get the thing going, it kind of carries you through the dead spot, is because of inertia, right? You get going down the road, you get all this momentum of this rider and bottles and shoes and bike. That's a lot of weight moving forward. Then you can start kind of axe chopping at the pedals, and the momentum of going forward on a flat road will carry you through that dead spot. You won't really necessarily notice it. But the second you change from flat terrain to a climb, now all of a sudden that dead spot has a huge price, because gravity is, we'll say, trying to suck you backwards down the climb, right? If you stopped all movement and didn't do anything and didn't fall over, eventually you'd start to roll backwards. And so now that dead spot becomes magnified. And also, because of some nuanced physics, our cadence tends to go down when we go uphill. So now the dead spot for each pedal stroke has a longer duration. And so, but people who live in Florida, how would they figure that out? This is how they would figure that out. They would be fine in the group. They'd be fine in the pace line. They're fine with changes of acceleration or micro accelerations in the peloton where they have to move up and advance or make it around someone's wheel in a crosswind. But if you had them ride by themselves at maximal intensity for a long duration, more than 10 minutes, their quads would just light up like a Christmas tree, and they just won't be able to sustain that effort. Because when your pedal stroke is less smooth, fundamentally what you're doing physiologically is you're load sharing less between the muscles. You're using a little too much quad for too narrow of a power band. And when you do that, when it's too punchy, right, it loads up the quads, and it loads up even specific fibers of the quads. So depending on if the riders, more common this day would be they slam their saddle really forward and it's really high. So all that's going to be focused right around the knee. So the quads right by the knee, the distal quadriceps right around the VMO, which is that big teardrop muscle on the inside of your knee, and all the quads right above your kneecap will just start to light up and be like, ow, 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 this really hurts. And if that happens when you ride at, we'll say, race pace intensity or threshold for about 10 minutes or longer, and your speed just sort of nosedives and your pace nosedives, and you can't sustain that effort, you could also tease out the same thing by doing a 5-minute VO2. You get the same result. It just happened quicker. If you're really good at riding in the group and winning sprints in Florida on 100-mile flat group rides, and great at pace lines and great at following wheels, but you can't be by yourself to save your life, that's a good indicator, right? The confounding variable is people from those types of locales would come to a race like Tour of the Gila, and they would get on the climb and they would start to go really slow. And some of that could be because they have facilitated this pedal stroke with a big dead spot, or because their saddle's too high and too far forward, and that's sort of exacerbating that problem. And they blame it on the change to elevation or the climbing, right? Which probably is, to be fair, part of what's going on. But the other part of it is they've just been pedaling on flat roads for too long, and their position is a little out of whack, right?
So how would they address that then, with different cadence work, torque work, or bike? I mean, if it's a saddle, I guess a bike fit, but
yeah, you got to make sure your bike fit's correct, so you can be in a biomechanical position to apply leverage to the stroke earlier in the power phase. So, commonly, you can tease this out in some of the Garmin metrics on their pedals, and maybe some of the other ones. I think Rotor has some of this too, although I've never looked at it, and maybe Favero does on their pedals. I'm not sure on that, to be honest. But you can look at the power band and the power arc on the front side of the pedal stroke, right? And again, it's not to say we want a 180-degree perfect power stroke, pedal stroke. That's not a real. It's sort of a goal of perfection that we know we'll never achieve. But you can have a pedal stroke that's too round and two crystal cranks. And just to dissuade this immediately, I want to say, in no universe should anyone ever actually try to pull up during seated cycling. This is like myth 101 about cycling. Is that the reason we clip into pedals is for you to pull up on the backside and make your pedal stroke more round. This is all garbage thinking. That's a whole other podcast. If you ever want to get into that, I'm happy to unpack that. There's lots of reasons behind it. I know I probably just like shot a sacred cow in the face, but that's a bomb I'm happy to drop, and an unpopular opinion I'm happy to have and talk about. So
podcast 3.
Yeah, podcast 3. Why you should not pull up on the pedals when seated. Standing is a different story, but seated, it's a no-fly zone, strict no-fly zone. So happy to unpack that one with you. But how you would really, the essence of developing a more efficient pedal stroke and eliminating your dead spot is to start to push forward and down when the crank is vertical at 12 o'clock. So you want to start to make your power stroke bigger, basically, right? Instead of this, think of it this way. How much pie do you want to eat? You want to eat more pie, not less. Pie is yummy, especially pumpkin pie. So you want a narrow slice of pie is when you're jabbing at the pedal stroke and you're only pedaling from, 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock. And you've got this spiky little punchy power stroke. We want to make that slice of pie a little bigger and go spread it out more till from 1 to 5 and get a big broad power stroke. And then we'll force you to load share amongst more muscle fibers. And that's why when you're doing a long effort, a 10-minute effort or 20-minute effort, when you load share, you can handle a lot of sustained load. But if you focus that load too much on one area of the quad and too few of fibers, once those fibers fatigue, then you're dead in the water. You can't do anything.
And are those the riders that they're not spinning and flowing? It's king, king, king.
Yeah.
King.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it.
You can see it. It's a very.
Oh yeah, it's a visual. I've got a couple.
I describe it as an axe chop. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Oh, dude, this was awesome. Again, thank you for coming back, and we're gonna post a link. What's your podcast called these days?
Mine's called Cycling in Alignment.
Okay. I know there was like a change at one point, so I want to make sure that was it. Check out Colby's podcast. We'll put this one up on there as well. Check out his other episodes. Hit him up on Instagram. Any other places that people can follow you on social media, whether it be Strava? I know you do a lot of TikTok dancing, I heard, Twitter, anything like that?
Not so much TikTok. Yeah, you can find me on my website, also colbypearce.com. I have in the past had a pretty extensive blog section. At the moment, it's not published because I'm kind of reworking it and refining it, but it'll be up there. So, I'll have some articles that might be helpful for some of your audience, like cadence versus torque, those kinds of things. And you can also check out some of my info on Team EF coaching. We just released our Skills Academy courses, which are super cool. That's where we're trying to help cyclists solve problems they have commonly on the bike. So I released a course that's all about cycling and the hips, for example. So people have problems with their hips and their lower back. I released one on cycling in the spine. My colleague, Zach Morris, released one on standing up out of the saddle. So really designed to help people solve problems if they've got pain on the bike. If they are looking for gems on technique, that kind of stuff, that might be helpful. Great way to supplement their other coaching and learning. Yeah.
Awesome. Everybody check those out. Good luck with your training and racing. Thanks for coming back to the podcast. We'll talk to you soon.